What if the most celebrated soldier in American history was not dismissed for pride, but silenced for a truth so terrifying it threatened to shatter the very foundation of global power? What if the story you were taught in school, the tale of a defiant general clashing with his president, was nothing more than a carefully constructed fable designed to conceal a secret war fought not on the battlefields of Korea, but in the shadows of our own government? The official record is clean, sanitized for public consumption. In the year 1951, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, a man who had accepted the surrender of an entire empire on the deck of the USS Missouri, was relieved of his command. The reason, they told us, was insubordination, a clash of wills over military strategy in a war half a world away. President Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher from Missouri, stood up to the Titan, the American Caesar, and proved that in a democracy, the civilian authority reigns supreme. It is a neat and tidy lesson in civics. It is also a lie. Our story begins not under the glare of news cameras or in the heat of battle, but decades later, in the cold, silent heart of the American military machine. Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, there is a place known only to a select few, the declassification archives. Here, mountains of paper, the silent witnesses to a century of secrets, wait for their time to expire. It is a realm of dust and whispers, where the ink of history slowly fades under the weight of time and black marker. One late autumn afternoon, a junior archivist, a young man tasked with the thankless job of cataloging long-forgotten documents from the Truman administration, stumbled upon a file that should have remained buried forever. It was a simple manila folder, brittle with age, marked with a faded stamp, "Eyes Only, POTUS." Inside was a sheaf of memos related to the Korean War, most of them mundane reports on logistics and troop movements. But one document was different. It was a memorandum for the president, dated just 3 days before MacArthur's public firing. The body of the text was almost entirely obliterated, covered in thick black lines of redaction, a dark tombstone over buried words. Yet, the censor had missed something. In the right-hand margin, scrawled in the president's own urgent, agitated hand, was a note. A single terrifying phrase that recontextualized everything we thought we knew. The ink was slightly smeared, as if written in haste, a moment of panic captured on paper 70 years ago. It read, "He knows about Project Chimera. We cannot allow the signal to be sent." Project Chimera? The signal. These words appear nowhere in any official history. They are ghosts in the National Archives, specters of a truth that has been ruthlessly suppressed. This was not a disagreement over crossing the Yalu River. This was not about politics or military protocol. This was about something else entirely. This was about containment. The firing of Douglas MacArthur was not a political decision, it was an act of existential desperation. They were not just removing a general from command, they were trying to unplug a prophet from his pulpit. For generations, historians have debated MacArthur's state of mind in his final years of command. They paint him as a man consumed by his own legend, an egotist who believed he was infallible, a warrior who couldn't accept the new realities of limited warfare in a nuclear age. This narrative was no accident. It was the first act of the cover-up. To hide the truth about Project Chimera, they had to first destroy the credibility of the one man who could expose it. They turned a hero into a caricature, a brilliant strategist into a reckless warmonger. Why? Because the truth he carried was a contagion they could not allow to spread. What was Project Chimera? And what was the signal that Truman, or the forces he answered to, so desperately feared? The memo offers no further clues. It is a locked door with no visible key. But this single forbidden phrase is a thread, and if we pull on it, the entire tapestry of our accepted history begins to unravel. It suggests that while America was focused on the spread of communism, a different kind of war was being waged, a clandestine struggle against an enemy with no flag and no name, an enemy that MacArthur had not only identified, but was prepared to expose to the world. The dismissal was the desperate last-ditch effort to silence him. His dramatic farewell address to Congress, the famous "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away" speech, was seen by the world as a poignant, dignified exit. But for those who knew the truth, for the hidden architects of Project Chimera, it must have been a moment of unimaginable tension. They were not listening for sentiment. They were listening for a code, a trigger word, a hint of the secret he possessed. They were waiting to see if the most famous soldier in the world would break his silence and send the signal. He never did. He faded away, just as he said he would, taking his secrets with him. Or so they thought. But the memo remains, a forgotten testament, a crack in the wall of silence. To understand the warning that cost MacArthur his career and sealed his legacy, we must look beyond the battlefields of Korea. We must travel back in time, to a place of ancient mysteries and forgotten empires, to the years he spent in a tropical archipelago that held the key, the Philippines. It was there, long before the world knew his name, that Douglas MacArthur discovered the truth. A truth that would set him on a collision course with the most powerful and secretive organization in human history. To understand the secret that would eventually lead to General MacArthur's downfall, we must pull back the curtain of time, leaving behind the sterile corridors of the Pentagon and traveling to a world of sweltering humidity, ancient secrets, and looming war. The year is 1936. The place, the Philippine archipelago, a jewel of the Pacific on the verge of independence, and a strategic chessboard for the empires of the world. Officially, Douglas MacArthur, then a field marshal of the Philippine Army, was tasked with a monumental but straightforward mission: to forge a modern fighting force capable of defending the islands from the growing shadow of Imperial Japan. He was a military advisor, an organizer, a teacher of war. But this official history is merely a sketch, a two-dimensional rendering of a man who was operating in a world of far deeper and more complex dimensions. His true work began where the neatly drawn maps of Manila ended, beyond the reach of military bases and political offices. It led him into the vast, emerald expanse of the archipelago's uncharted interiors, into jungles so dense they were called the Green Twilight, where the sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, and the air hung thick with the scent of orchids and decay. MacArthur, the soldier, was also MacArthur, the explorer, driven by a fascination that bordered on obsession with the island's rich and esoteric folklore. He spent countless hours, not just with military strategists, but with village elders, mystics, and tribal historians who spoke of things that had no place in a 20th century military briefing. They told him tales not of common spirits or local gods, but of the Matandang Panahon, the old time, when beings who were not men walked the earth. They spoke of a cataclysm that had reshaped the very islands, and of artifacts left behind, objects of immense power that were neither human nor divine in origin. The most persistent of these legends, whispered across dozens of islands and in multiple dialects, was the story of the Bato ng Tala, the Star Stone. It was said to be a piece of the night sky that had fallen to earth in a time before memory, a dark crystal that held the power to sing the world's true song. The legends claim that the stone did not predict the future, but rather revealed the hidden patterns of the present, the invisible threads of power that connect all things. While his American contemporaries dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, MacArthur listened with an unnerving intensity. He saw not myth, but a garbled history, a set of directions disguised as a fable. Guided by these fragmented clues, he began to organize a series of surveying expeditions deep into the mountainous spine of Luzon, the largest island. To the colonial government, these were routine mapping missions. In reality, they were treasure hunts for a prize of unimaginable significance. His team was small, hand-picked for loyalty and specialized skills: a geologist, a linguist who had mastered ancient dialects, and a brilliant young signals officer who saw radio waves as a new frontier of discovery. In the spring of 1937, after months of dead ends and grueling treks through hostile terrain, a local guide, an old man from a tribe that had never before encountered an outsider, finally led them to a place marked on no map. It was a narrow, vine-choked canyon, its walls carved with symbols that resembled no known script, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the peripheral vision. At the end of the canyon lay the mouth of a cave, an entrance that did not appear natural. It was a perfect dark circle, humming with a almost subaudible frequency that made the fillings in their teeth ache. Inside, the air was cool and utterly still. The cave system was a labyrinth, but its path seemed subtly guided, its twists and turns leading them ever deeper into the mountain's heart. Finally, they entered a vast, circular chamber. In the center, resting on a natural pedestal of rock, was the source of the hum. It was the Star Stone, the Luzon Object. It was nothing like the crude idol they might have expected. It was a flawless ovoid of a material that looked like obsidian, but drank the light from their torches, creating an area of profound darkness around itself. It was roughly the size of a man's torso, its surface covered in impossibly intricate geometric etchings that seemed to flow and rearrange themselves like liquid script. When MacArthur reached out to touch it, the surface was not cold as stone, but felt like living tissue, cool and unnervingly smooth. The humming intensified, and the etchings on its surface began to glow with a soft, internal, violet light. For weeks, they studied the object in secret, transporting it to a secure, lead-lined chamber in MacArthur's private residence in Manila. It resisted every attempt at analysis. It was impervious to drills, and X-rays revealed nothing but a uniform, internal blackness. The breakthrough came from the young signals officer, acting on a hunch drawn from the legends that the stone would dang in response to a certain celestial alignment. He theorized that the object was a resonator. He began bombarding it with a spectrum of radio frequencies. For days, nothing happened. Then, he tried a complex, pulsating long-wave frequency, a signal pattern he had designed by translating the object's shifting geometric patterns into mathematical values. The moment the signal hit the crystal, the humming stopped. The room fell into an absolute suffocating silence. Then, the object began to glow, its violet light filling the chamber. But it did not project images onto the wall. It projected them directly into their minds. It was not a vision, it was a deluge, a torrent of pure information, of raw, unmediated truth that bypassed sight and sound and poured directly into their consciousness. They saw the sweep of human history, not as a series of chaotic events, but as a meticulously managed project. They saw the faces of men in the shadows of Pharaoh's courts, in the back rooms of Roman senates, in the banking houses of Renaissance Europe, and in the boardrooms of modern corporations. They saw assassinations disguised as accidents, revolutions funded by silent partners, and wars ignited to serve a hidden agenda. This was the true song the legends spoke of. The object was a cipher, a key that unlocked the greatest secret in human history, the existence of a global shadow organization, a parasitic entity that had intertwined itself with human civilization since its inception. The device showed them its structure, a multi-headed beast with competing factions that nonetheless worked towards a common goal of absolute control. The name came to MacArthur in that moment of horrifying revelation, a name for the monster whose form he was now seeing, Chimera. He saw that this organization, Chimera, was not ideological. It was not communist or capitalist, democratic or tyrannical. It used all ideologies as tools, as masks. Its only allegiance was to its own power. The Luzon Object was a map, a detailed schematic of the enemy's command structure, its assets, its long-term strategies. It showed MacArthur how Chimera was preparing for the coming World War, funding both the Axis powers and the Allied industrial complex, ensuring that no matter who won the physical conflict, the organization would emerge with an even tighter grip on the levers of global power. In that lead-lined room, surrounded by the silent, glowing crystal, Douglas MacArthur's world was irrevocably shattered and remade. The man who had entered the room, a soldier of the United States, emerged as something else entirely. He was now the sole custodian of a truth that could get him killed by every powerful institution on the planet. He understood that his mission to build the Philippine army was a pathetic sideshow. The real war was not coming. It had been raging for centuries, and humanity was losing, utterly unaware it was even a combatant. This knowledge became his core, his iron certainty. It was the source of what others would later call his godlike arrogance, his refusal to bow to presidents and politicians. They were playing checkers. He was the only man on the board who knew the game was truly chess, and he had just been shown a glimpse of his opponent's every possible move. He took the Luzon Object, swore his men to an unbreakable oath of secrecy, and began to plan. His war had just begun. The 7th of December, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a brutal, shocking act that plunged a hesitant America into the crucible of the Second World War. That is the story we all know. But what if the primary target of that day's aggression was not the Pacific Fleet anchored in the serene waters of Hawaii? What if the true objective of the attack, the one that mattered to the real powers pulling the strings, was a single man stationed thousands of miles away? What if the entire opening act of the Pacific War was an elaborate, bloody gambit designed to trap and eliminate the one Allied commander who had seen the face of the true enemy? When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the forces of Chimera were not just trying to cripple American naval power. They were trying to isolate Douglas MacArthur. Using their deep-rooted influence within the Japanese military command, they orchestrated a synchronized, overwhelming assault on the Philippines. They knew where he was. More importantly, they knew what he possessed. The Luzon Object, the Star Stone, was a beacon of truth in a world built on lies. And Chimera needed to extinguish its light, or, better yet, capture it for themselves. The invasion of the Philippines was not a simple act of imperial expansion. It was a targeted decapitation strike, aimed at the heart of the nascent resistance against their global control. The official narrative portrays the defense of the Philippines as a tragic, heroic, but ultimately doomed effort. MacArthur's forces, a mix of undertrained Filipino recruits and undersupplied American soldiers, were simply no match for the seasoned legions of General Hama. History records MacArthur's agonizing decision to retreat, to declare Manila an open city, and to withdraw his forces to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. He was criticized in whispers back in Washington for being caught unprepared, for losing the archipelago so swiftly. But this was the greatest deception of his career. It was not a failure, it was a calculated sacrifice. MacArthur knew he could not hold the islands against the full might of the Japanese war machine, a machine secretly supercharged by Chimera's industrial assets. His primary objective was not to win an unwinnable battle. It was to execute a desperate mission of concealment. While the world watched the dramatic siege of Bataan, a small, hand-picked unit, the same men who had been with him in the cave, undertook a perilous journey. Their mission? To transport the Luzon Object from its secure vault in Manila to a new, deep earth hiding place, a pre-prepared chamber hidden within the complex tunnel systems of Corregidor itself. The brutal, bloody fighting on the beaches and in the jungles of Bataan was a masterful, tragic diversion. Every soldier who died there bought another precious hour for the real prize to be secured. When President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia, he initially refused. To the world, this seemed like the prideful act of a captain determined to go down with his ship. The truth was far more complex. He could not leave until he received confirmation that the object was secure and that a contingency plan was in place. Only when a coded message reached him, a simple 3-word phrase hidden in a routine supply report, did he agree to leave his men. As his patrol boat sliced through the dark, enemy-infested waters, he made a promise. It was a promise broadcast to the world, a message of hope to the people of the Philippines. I shall return. But this iconic phrase was not just for public consumption. It was a weapon. It was a direct, unambiguous message aimed at the heart of Chimera. It was MacArthur, the man they had tried to trap and destroy, announcing to the unseen enemy that he had escaped their snare. He was not defeated. He was still in the game, and he was coming back for them. In the secret councils of Chimera, from their hidden enclaves in Tokyo to their boardrooms in Zurich, those 4 words must have landed like a thunderclap. The hunt was now on. From his new headquarters in Australia, MacArthur began to wage 2 wars simultaneously. The first was the public war, the one that filled the newspapers and history books. The second was the secret war, a shadow conflict fought with intelligence and intuition, guided by the horrifying knowledge he had gained from the Luzon Object. The famous island-hopping campaign, a strategy that is now taught in every military academy, was his masterstroke, a brilliant double game. To the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, he presented his plans in the cold, hard logic of military necessity. Each island, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Biak, Morotai, was presented as a vital stepping stone on the path to Tokyo, a necessary rung on the ladder to victory. He argued for airfields, for anchorages, for strategic positions to cut off Japanese supply lines, and his logic was impeccable. But it was all a cover story. The true targets of the island-hopping campaign were chosen by a different kind of intelligence. Before each major operation, MacArthur would retreat into a locked, soundproofed room with his most trusted signals officer. There, using a complex portable device of their own design, they would attempt to commune with the memories of the Luzon Object to access the mental map of Chimera's infrastructure that had been burned into their minds. The islands they chose were not merely strategic locations, they were critical nodes in Chimera's Pacific network. The bloody, grinding battle for Guadalcanal was not just about securing Henderson Field. Deep within the island's volcanic mountains, as the Luzon Object had revealed, was one of Chimera's primary communications relays, a psychic amplifier of sorts that allowed their leadership to coordinate operations across the globe, a technology far beyond conventional understanding. The relentless fighting was to ensure that this facility was utterly destroyed. His controversial push through the dense, unforgiving jungles of New Guinea, a campaign that many in the Navy considered a costly and unnecessary diversion, was a direct assault on Chimera's financial operations. The island was a hub for laundering the vast wealth the organization was plundering from conquered Asia. The heavily fortified Japanese bases he targeted were not just military garrisons, they were vaults, protecting assets that were funding Chimera's long-term plans. When his men took the island of Biak, they discovered a bunker complex far more extensive and sophisticated than necessary for a simple airfield. Inside, among the ruins, they found scorched ledgers written in a bizarre geometric script that intelligence officers dismissed as a meaningless local code. Only MacArthur knew he was looking at Chimera's accounting books. This double game explains his constant, ferocious battles with the Navy and the leadership in Washington. They accused him of being an egotistical prima donna, of putting his own theater of war above all others. In reality, he was a man possessed by a terrible urgency that he could not share. He was fighting an enemy they couldn't see, for stakes they couldn't possibly comprehend. His frustration was that of a surgeon trying to explain a cancerous tumor to a committee of doctors who insisted on treating only the patient's superficial wounds. The climax of this secret war was his return. The invasion of Leyte in 1944 was not just the liberation of the Philippines. It was MacArthur going back to reclaim his sword from the stone. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history, was Chimera's final, desperate attempt to stop him. They threw the entire remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy at him, a suicidal charge that made little conventional military sense. But they were not trying to save the Philippines. They were trying to prevent MacArthur from reaching Corregidor and reactivating the Luzon Object. When MacArthur finally waded ashore at Leyte, the famous photograph captured a moment of supposed triumph. But his eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, were not looking at the cheering crowds. They were looking inward, focused on the final, most dangerous phase of his mission. He had fought his way across the Pacific, dismantling the enemy's network piece by piece. He had returned, just as he had promised. The war against Japan was almost won. But the war against Chimera was about to enter a new, terrifying stage, moving from the jungles of the Pacific to the very heart of the defeated empire. In the late summer of 1945, the world exhaled a collective ragged breath of relief. The Empire of the Sun had fallen. From the skies above Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur descended, not merely as a conqueror, but as a proconsul, a modern shogun vested with a power so absolute it was rivaled only by that of the emperors of old. The official histories paint a clear picture of his mission: to oversee the demilitarization of Japan, to guide its shattered society towards democracy, and to rebuild a nation from the ashes of its own fiery ambitions. He was to be a lawgiver, a teacher, a stern but fair patriarch to a defeated people. This benevolent narrative is, perhaps, the most audacious lie of all. MacArthur's arrival in Japan was not the beginning of a reconstruction. It was the continuation of a hunt. He was an exterminator who had followed a wounded beast into its lair. The knowledge gleaned from the Luzon Object had provided MacArthur with a terrifyingly detailed blueprint of Chimera's global network. It had shown him that while Germany had been a critical theater of operations for the Shadow Organization, Japan was something far more profound. It was not just a branch office, it was a monastery. It was a place where Chimera's influence was ancient, woven into the very spiritual and cultural DNA of the nation. The organization's power here was not just held in boardrooms and military headquarters, but in Shinto shrines veiled in mist, in ancient families whose lineage was a secret history of Japan itself, and in the silent, enigmatic heart of the imperial palace. MacArthur understood that to simply cut the branches of the Japanese military would be a fool's errand. He had to pull the entire poisonous tree out by its roots. His rule over Japan, the period known as the Occupation, was a masterclass in this secret war. Every major reform, celebrated by historians as a pillar of enlightened post-war policy, was, in fact, a precision-guided missile aimed at a specific component of Chimera's infrastructure. Consider the new Japanese Constitution, his most lauded achievement. Its centerpiece, Article 9, the famous Peace Clause, is hailed as a monument to pacifism, a promise that Japan would never again threaten the world with war. The truth is infinitely more pragmatic and ruthless. MacArthur, guided by the object's revelations, saw that Chimera had used the Japanese people's deep-seated sense of martial pride and loyalty as its most potent weapon. Article 9 was not a gift of peace, it was a cage. It was a permanent disarming of Chimera's most disciplined and fanatical army, an ideological poison pill inserted directly into the nation's new soul to ensure that this particular sword could never be drawn again in their service. Then came his assault on the Zaibatsu, the colossal industrial conglomerates, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, that had been the engine of the Japanese war machine. Publicly, this was an act of economic justice, an American-style trust-busting operation designed to break up the monopolies that had profited from conquest. In reality, it was a heist. MacArthur's investigators, a covert unit operating outside the official channels of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, weren't just looking for evidence of war profiteering. They were following a trail of dark money that led from the factories of Osaka through dummy corporations in Shanghai and Manchuria, and finally to the vaults of private banks in Zurich and unseen accounts on Wall Street. The Luzon Object had shown him that the Zaibatsu were Chimera's treasury. His teams conducted raids not just on corporate headquarters, but on the private estates of their patriarchs, seizing not just financial records, but ancient family scrolls and hidden ledgers written in complex, coded calligraphy. They were dismantling a financial network that had been draining the wealth of Asia for a century to fund Chimera's global ambitions. But MacArthur's most daring and dangerous maneuver was his handling of the emperor himself. The world, and indeed many in Washington, demanded that Emperor Hirohito be tried as a war criminal. The man in whose name millions had died surely had to face justice. MacArthur's steadfast refusal to do so, his insistence on preserving the chrysanthemum throne, has been endlessly debated. Was it a pragmatic act to prevent a popular uprising? Or was it the decision of a man who had developed a strange respect for the institution? It was neither. It was the calculated move of a master strategist holding the enemy's king in check. The Luzon Object had revealed the most sensitive secret of Chimera's Japanese operations. The emperor was not the master of the organization, but its most sacred asset. The true power resided in a shadowy council within the imperial household itself, a group of ancient families and high-ranking priests known internally as the Kinkei no Mamoribito, the keepers of the golden pheasant. This group had cultivated the myth of the emperor's divinity for centuries, using him as an infallible shield, a holy smokescreen behind which they could conduct their affairs with absolute impunity. To prosecute Hirohito would have been to strike the shield, not the men hiding behind it. It would have plunged Japan into chaos, providing the keepers with the perfect cover to disappear with their secrets and assets intact. So, MacArthur played a different game. He took control of the shield. His famous meeting with Hirohito, immortalized in a photograph that shocked the world, was the pivotal moment of this secret war. The image of the towering, confident American general standing beside the small, formally dressed emperor was not about humiliating a defeated monarch. It was a silent, brutal message delivered directly to the keepers. It declared, without a single word, "Your God is now mine. Your holiest symbol answers to me. I control your access. I control his words. I control the very air he breathes. You are exposed." He had taken their most powerful piece off the board and turned it into his own. While he publicly protected the emperor, MacArthur's secret units began the silent purge. Men who were not on any war crimes list began to vanish. An obscure imperial courtier would suffer a boating accident. A high priest at a particularly influential shrine would be found dead of a heart attack. A distant cousin of the imperial family, a man whose existence was known to only a handful of people, would be bundled onto a blacked-out transport plane in the middle of the night, officially repatriated to a non-existent ancestral home in a distant prefecture, never to be heard from again. Each disappearance was a snip of a thread in Chimera's web, guided by the terrible knowledge MacArthur carried. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place deep within the imperial archives, in a section so restricted that not even the emperor himself was permitted to enter without the keeper's consent. There, MacArthur's team found what they were looking for. Not a document or a confession, but a series of celestial maps, exquisitely painted on silk scrolls hundreds of years old. These maps depicted constellations that were subtly, impossibly different from the night sky known to science. And at the center of these alien star charts were geometric symbols that were identical to the flowing script on the surface of the Luzon Object. In that moment, the true horrifying nature of the enemy became clear. Chimera was not just a human conspiracy for power and wealth. Its roots were not in the soil of the earth. The Japanese keepers were not just guarding a political secret. They were the custodians of an ancient contact, a dark covenant with a power that was not of this world. The war MacArthur had been fighting was about to escalate beyond his wildest imaginings. He had cornered the beast in its lair, only to discover that the lair was a gateway to something far worse. And he knew, with a cold, sickening certainty, that the beast would not remain cornered for long. It would be forced to create a new conflict, a new crisis, to distract him and reclaim its power. A war was coming, not in the distant future, but now, and the fuse would be lit on a small, divided peninsula just a short distance across the sea, Korea. The year 1950. The world, still nursing the raw scars of a global war, found itself teetering once more on the precipice of chaos. On a quiet Sunday morning in June, the fragile peace was shattered by the rumble of tanks and the tramp of marching boots across a line drawn in the sand of a remote Asian peninsula. The North Korean People's Army surged south across the 38th parallel, and the Korean War began. For a world exhausted by conflict, it seemed a sudden and inexplicable catastrophe, a new front opening in the cold, ideological war against communism. This was the first broadcast of the official story, the one that would be printed in every newspaper and beamed across every radio wave. It was a simple, digestible narrative of aggression and response, of freedom versus tyranny, and it was a lie from the very first shot. The Korean War was not a surprise. It was an answer. It was the calculated, venomous counterstrike of a wounded beast. In the secret chambers where the true power of Chimera resided, the reports from their agents in post-war Japan must have painted a picture of utter disaster. MacArthur, guided by the unholy light of the Luzon Object, had systematically disemboweled their operations. He had seized their wealth, broken their command structure, and caged their imperial puppet. He had committed the one unforgivable sin. He had made them vulnerable. Chimera, the eternal parasite, the master manipulator, had been outmaneuvered. Such a defeat could not be tolerated. They needed a new board, a new game, a new crisis so profound it would consume the world's attention. More than that, they needed to draw their nemesis out from his fortress in Tokyo and onto a killing ground of their own choosing. Korea was that killing ground. It was not a war of ideology. It was an assassination plot on a geopolitical scale. When President Truman named Douglas MacArthur the commander of the new United Nations forces, the world saw it as the only logical choice. Who else but the hero of the Pacific could stem the red tide? But in the quiet guarded rooms of the Daiichi Seimei building in Tokyo, MacArthur and his small circle of initiated loyalists knew the truth. The appointment was not an honor, it was a summons. It was the enemy, through their unwitting pawns in Washington, calling him out. To refuse the command would be to admit defeat, to allow Chimera to consolidate its power and erase the gains he had so painfully won in Japan. To accept was to knowingly walk into a meticulously prepared trap. He had no choice. He had to engage the enemy on their chosen ground, armed only with his terrible secret and the hope that he could turn their own trap against them. His first move was a stroke of such audacious brilliance it is still studied as the pinnacle of military art: the amphibious landing at Incheon. The plan was deemed suicidal by the Joint Chiefs. The tides were treacherous, the seawalls were high, and the city was heavily defended. But MacArthur was unshakable, displaying a certainty that his critics called arrogance, but was, in fact, something far deeper. He was not just looking at military maps of tides and beachheads. He was consulting the mental map provided by the Luzon Object. The true prize of Incheon was not the liberation of Seoul, as vital as that was. The real target was a facility hidden in the hills just outside the city, a place that appeared on no official survey. It was another node in Chimera's network, a psychic and data processing center that served as the nerve cluster for their entire East Asian operation. The thousands of Marines storming the beaches were a magnificent thundering cover for a small, ghost-like unit of men, the veterans of his secret war, whose sole mission was to penetrate that facility and seize its secrets or burn it to the ground. The Incheon landing was a gamble of staggering proportions because the stakes were not a city, but a piece of the enemy's soul. The landing was a stunning success. The UN forces drove the North Koreans back in disarray, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed the war might be won. But MacArthur knew better. This was merely the opening act. He was now deep inside the enemy's territory, and he knew the real army was yet to show itself. As his forces pushed north, closer and closer to the Yalu River, the border with China, the warnings from Washington grew more frantic. He was provoking the Chinese, they said. He was risking a wider war. They saw him as a reckless commander blinded by victory. They could not see that he was deliberately striking the hornet's nest. He was trying to force Chimera to play its hand, to call its hidden army onto the field. He wanted to expose the truth that the communist government in Beijing and the one in Pyongyang were not allies, but puppets, their strings pulled by the same unseen hand. In November, the trap sprung. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers, a ghost army that American intelligence had failed to detect, swarmed across the Yalu River, catching the UN forces in a brutal, overwhelming onslaught. The official history records this as MacArthur's greatest intelligence failure. The truth is, it was his greatest fear realized. He had poked the beast, and the beast had responded with a ferocity that even he had underestimated. He had wanted to expose the puppeteer, but in doing so, he had brought the full weight of the puppet state down upon his men. It was in the depths of that horrific winter retreat, with his armies being savaged by the cold and the endless waves of Chinese soldiers, that MacArthur prepared his final, desperate gambit. He sent a series of top-secret cables to the Joint Chiefs, proposals so radical they would seal his fate. He requested a naval blockade of the Chinese coast, the bombing of their industrial heartland, and most controversially, he demanded discretionary use of 34 atomic bombs. When this demand became public, the world reacted with universal horror. Douglas MacArthur, the hero, had become a monster, a man willing to plunge the world into a nuclear holocaust to salvage his own failing war. This was the narrative Chimera had been waiting for. They used their assets in the media, in the United Nations, and in the halls of Washington to amplify this story, to paint their greatest enemy as an unhinged warmonger. The man had to be stopped. But they were not stopping a madman. They were stopping a surgeon from cutting out a cancer. The coordinates MacArthur had supplied for his proposed atomic strikes were not major cities like Beijing or Shanghai. They were desolate, remote locations in the mountainous interior of Manchuria. They were the precise locations, revealed to him by the Luzon Object, of Chimera's Central Asian Command Center. He was not proposing to terrorize a population. He was proposing to use the most powerful weapon known to man to perform a kind of psychic neurosurgery on the planet, to obliterate the subterranean brain of his enemy. It was a monstrous, terrifying proposal, but it was born not of madness, but of a desperate, ice-cold logic. He saw a global parasite that was on the verge of consolidating its control, and he was willing to use radioactive fire to burn it out. He was denied. Truman and the world saw only the risk of World War III. They could not see the hidden war that had been raging for decades. In that moment, MacArthur was defeated. Not by the Chinese armies in Korea, but by the sophisticated web of influence and deception woven by an enemy his own government refused to see. He was checkmated. He could not reveal the true target without revealing a truth so profound it would shatter the global order. He was a prophet no one could believe. The war in Korea would grind on, a bloody and pointless stalemate that served Chimera's purposes perfectly. It bled America of men and treasure, and it provided the perfect stage for the public execution of the one man who had ever truly threatened them. The Korean gambit had failed, the trap was now closed, and the axe was about to fall. The heart of a nation is not a place, but a moment. It is the instant when a decision is made in a quiet room that will echo through the ages, shaping the lives of millions yet unborn. In the first week of April, in the year 1951, the heart of the American empire was not beating in the foxholes of Korea or the bustling streets of New York. It was sequestered within the pristine white walls of a single sacred room. The air in Washington that spring was thick and heavy, not with the promise of cherry blossoms, but with the suffocating miasma of intrigue. The newspapers screamed of the schism, the titanic clash of wills between the president and his general. It was a story of policy and pride, of strategy and insubordination. But the whispers in the Georgetown salons and the back corridors of the Capitol told a different tale, a story of a conflict so fundamental it threatened to tear the Republic apart. Douglas MacArthur was not recalled through official channels. There was no curt telegram, no public summons. The message came through a clandestine back channel, a trusted military aide from his past, who appeared at his Tokyo headquarters with no official orders and a single verbal instruction. The president requests your presence, at once, and in absolute secrecy. It was a summons to a duel. MacArthur flew not on a military transport adorned with his 5 stars, but on a repurposed cargo plane, unmarked and stripped of all insignia, that took a deliberately circuitous route across the Pacific. He traveled under a false name, a ghost slipping back into the country that revered him as a demigod. His presence on its soil, a secret known only to a handful of men. He was being brought in through the servants' entrance to be judged in the master's chambers. He arrived at the White House late at night, long after the last of the reporters had departed, and the lights in the nearby government buildings had been extinguished. The limousine that met him on the tarmac had no flags, and it did not pull up to the Grand North Portico. It slid silently to a halt at an unmarked service gate in the high wrought iron fence. He was met not by a welcoming committee, but by two grim-faced Secret Service agents, their faces impassive masks, their silence a tangible thing. They led him through a stark, sterile basement corridor, past steam pipes and electrical conduits, the hidden guts of the great house, and up a private staircase that emerged into the hushed, hallowed space of the West Wing. The entire journey was conducted in a profound, unnerving silence, the unspoken protocol of a conspiracy in motion. The Oval Office was not, on this night, a place of majestic power. It felt like a tribunal, a soundproof chamber prepared for an interrogation. The air was stale with cigar smoke and tension. President Harry S. Truman stood behind the resolute desk, but he did not stand alone. To his right, partially obscured by the shadows beyond the presidential seal on the rug, was the hulking, immovable figure of J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Hoover was not looking at MacArthur. He was studying his own perfectly manicured fingernails, a portrait of bored menace. And standing near the fireplace, his face a mask of patrician disdain, was Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, the very embodiment of the Eastern establishment that had long viewed MacArthur with a mixture of fear and contempt. This was not a meeting, it was an ambush. Truman began, his voice tight, his Missouri accent sharp with rehearsed anger. He spoke of the war, of MacArthur's unauthorized public statements, of his letters to congressmen that undermined the administration's policy. He spoke of insubordination, of the chain of command, of the sacred principle of civilian control over the military. He was reciting the cover story, laying the official groundwork for the verdict that had already been decided. MacArthur stood before the desk, ramrod straight, his face an unreadable sculpture of bronze. He listened patiently, letting the president exhaust his litany of official grievances. He knew this was merely the ritual before the sacrifice. When Truman finally fell silent, the room was thick with unspoken words. Then, MacArthur made his move. He stepped forward and placed a single, black leather-bound folder on the polished surface of the desk. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to suck all the air from the room. Inside this folder was not a defense of his military strategy. It was the distillation of his entire secret war, a terrifying summary of the revelations of the Luzon Object. It was the truth. "Mr. President," MacArthur began, his voice low and steady, a resonant timbre that had commanded armies and silenced parliaments. "Your war is not with the communists in Korea. Your war, our war, has been with an enemy you have refused to see." He proceeded to outline the existence of Chimera, the shadow organization that treated nations like chess pieces and history like a script it was writing. He spoke of its ancient origins, its infiltration of global finance, its manipulation of the Second World War, and its deep-rooted presence within the very fabric of American power. He named names, powerful figures on Wall Street, respected elder statesmen, men who were considered pillars of the Republic. He connected the financial network of the Zaibatsu directly to shell corporations in Delaware. He laid out the secret history, the war behind the wars, with the cold, irrefutable precision of a mathematician revealing a terrible proof. Hoover and Acheson did not move a muscle, but Truman's folksy, combative demeanor began to dissolve. His face, already pale under the lamplight, seemed to shrink. MacArthur then opened the folder. He did not pull out reports or memos. He produced a single silk scroll, carefully preserved. It was one of the celestial maps recovered from the Imperial Archives in Tokyo. He unrolled it on the desk. "This," he said, "is their Bible and their map. It shows a star system that does not exist. The symbols you see here are not Japanese. They are the language of the entity they serve." He then presented his final, terrible conclusion, that the war in Korea was a trap designed to bog America down while Chimera recovered from the wounds he had inflicted upon it in Japan. His proposal to bomb Manchuria, he explained, was not an act of madness. It was a targeted strike against their central command, an attempt to decapitate the serpent in its nest. In that moment, Harry S. Truman was no longer the President of the United States. He was a small man from Missouri who had just been shown that the world was run by monsters. A former White House aide, now an old man haunted by the memory of that night, would later recall being stationed outside the door. He said he could not hear all the words, but he could feel the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. He would never forget the look on Truman's face when he later emerged for a glass of water. It was not anger, it was not frustration. It was the stark, primal terror of a man who had stared into the abyss and realized it had been staring back at him his entire life. MacArthur gave his ultimatum. "You can use this knowledge, Mr. President. You can tell the American people the truth. We can fight them together." The room was silent. Truman looked from the alien star chart on his desk to the impassive face of J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI director gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a veto. The decision had been made long before MacArthur had ever boarded the plane. Chimera was too powerful, too embedded. To fight it would be to destroy the world they knew in order to save it. Truman slid the folder back across the desk. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a dry whisper. "General, you are a great American, but your service has affected you. You are relieved of all your commands, effective immediately. This meeting is over." He had made his choice. He had chosen the comfortable lie over the terrifying truth. He had chosen to remain the warden of a prison he now knew he was also an inmate in. The dismissal was an act of self-preservation, but not for the country. It was for the system Chimera had built. They had successfully contained the truth by branding its bearer a heretic. MacArthur gave a slow, formal nod. He did not argue. He had delivered his prophecy, and it had been rejected. He turned and walked out of the Oval Office, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. He was no longer a general of the army. He was a man out of time, a ghost leaving the machine, carrying a secret that was now his alone to bear. The cover-up had begun. The blow, when it finally fell, was delivered not with the sharp, clean efficiency of a guillotine, but with the blunt, brutal force of a cudgel wrapped in velvet. The official announcement of General MacArthur's dismissal hit the world like a seismic shockwave. To the public, it was an act of inexplicable political betrayal, the humiliation of a national icon by a small, unpopular president. In the secret corridors of power, however, it was the final, triumphant move in a meticulously planned checkmate. The beast had not only survived its encounter with the hunter, it had now turned the hunter into a trophy, a warning to any who might dare to follow in his footsteps. The operation to silence Douglas MacArthur was complete. The operation to erase him, however, was just beginning. His return to the United States was not the quiet, disgraced exit that Truman and his handlers had envisioned. It was a political, spontaneous combustion, a tidal wave of popular adoration that terrified the establishment. From San Francisco to Washington, millions poured into the streets. The ticker-tape parades were biblical in their scale, blizzards of paper raining down on a man who, in the eyes of the people, was more than a general. He was the living embodiment of American victory and resolve. He was a Caesar returning to Rome, not in defeat, but in triumph, carried on the shoulders of a populace that sensed, even if it could not articulate, that a great injustice had been done. This outpouring of support was a dangerous, unpredictable wildfire, and Chimera knew it had to be extinguished before it could burn down the carefully constructed prison of lies they called reality. The man tasked with this delicate and dirty work was the Dark Prince of the American national security state, the architect of 1,000 secrets and 1,000,000 fears, J. Edgar Hoover. From his fortified throne in the heart of the Justice Department, the FBI director had watched MacArthur's rise with the keen, predatory eye of a rival predator. He saw in the general not a patriot, but a competing center of power, a charismatic figure who commanded a loyalty that superseded mere government. Under the direct, unwritten authority of the forces that had orchestrated the Oval Office showdown, Hoover unleashed the full, terrifying apparatus of his shadow empire against a single American citizen. It was a campaign of character assassination so subtle, so pervasive, and so patient that its victim would never see the knife, only feel the slow, inexorable bleed. It began with whispers. Hoover's agents, masters of the innuendo and the well-placed rumor, began to cultivate assets in the press, in the halls of Congress, and most importantly, within the Pentagon itself. Suddenly, high-ranking but anonymous military sources began to appear in the columns of friendly journalists, expressing deep concern over the general's erratic behavior in the final months of the Korean War. Carefully selected, out-of-context quotes from his operational directives were leaked, painting him not as a brilliant strategist, but as a reckless gambler willing to sacrifice his own men for personal glory. Next came the psychological profiles. The FBI, using its deep connections within the intelligence community, commissioned and then selectively leaked psychiatric evaluations that had been secretly compiled years earlier. These documents, penned by men who had never even met MacArthur, diagnosed him with a litany of pathologies. He was a megalomaniac, a man suffering from a messianic complex. He was narcissistic, paranoid, increasingly detached from reality. The term delusions of grandeur began to appear with increasing frequency. The narrative was meticulously crafted. Here was a great man, a tragic hero, who had simply cracked under the immense strain of his 50-year career. The story of his secret Oval Office meeting, should it ever leak, was being preemptively neutralized. His warnings about Chimera would not be seen as a revelation. They would be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, the fantastical conspiracies of a man who had lost his grip. This whispering campaign was the prelude to the main event, MacArthur's farewell address to a joint session of Congress. For the American people, it was a moment of high, poignant drama, the nation's greatest soldier bidding a final, emotional goodbye. For MacArthur, it was his last broadcast to the world, his final opportunity to send a message past the censors and the assassins of character. And for Hoover and the hidden masters of Chimera, it was a moment of supreme, heart-stopping tension. They were listening not to the words, but to the spaces between them, praying he would not break his unspoken vow of silence and reveal the terrible truth. The speech was a masterpiece of double meaning, a public eulogy that served as a secret call to arms. When he spoke of the new and bewildering challenges in Asia that defied conventional military solutions, the world heard a reflection on the complexities of the Cold War. But the handful of men who knew, the survivors of the Luzon expeditions, the secret units from the Pacific War, the loyalists purged from the occupation of Japan, heard a direct reference to an enemy that was not human, a conflict that was not of this earth. When he spoke with such raw emotion of the American fighting man, the finest soldiers in history, it was not just patriotic sentiment. It was a direct address to his scattered, hidden army, a reminder of their shared experience, their secret knowledge, and the oath they had taken. And then came the final, immortal lines, the words that would be etched onto his monument. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. The world heard poetry, a humble acceptance of his fate. His loyalists heard an order, fade away. It was not a lament, it was a command. Go dark, break contact, melt into the background of civilian life, erase your trail, become ghosts, preserve what you know, protect the legacy of the Luzon Object. The war has not ended. It has simply moved into the shadows. With that final coded message delivered, Douglas MacArthur began to fade. He retreated from the public stage, abandoning any political ambition he might have had. He took up residence in a surprisingly modest suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, a gilded cage where the world could see him as a living relic, a lion in winter, safely neutered and put on display. The media, following the script Hoover had written for them, portrayed him as a man of the past, living out his days writing his memoirs and reflecting on bygone glories. This too was a lie. The suite at the Waldorf was not a retirement home. It was a watchtower. It was the nerve center of a resistance that no longer had a name. From this quiet, carpeted command post, MacArthur became a different kind of general. He was no longer a commander of armies, but a ghost in the machine. He used his immense, unparalleled network of personal shiitaks, built over half a century on every continent, to create a private intelligence agency that answered only to him. He received whispered reports from disenchanted generals in the Pentagon, cryptic letters from old comrades in Asia, and financial analyses from retired industrialists who owed him their fortunes. He was a silent, unseen observer, tracking the movements of Chimera, watching as the organization slowly, patiently repaired the damage he had done. He could no longer fight them in the open, but he could watch and he could wait. He was a ghost, haunting the corridors of power, a constant low-grade fever in the blood of the men who had betrayed him. A reminder that the truth he carried had not died, but had simply faded from view. In the quiet, cloistered world of the American presidency, there exists a tradition known to only a handful of souls. On the first day a new president takes office, after the pomp and the parades, after the inaugural balls have ended, and the last of the well-wishers have departed, the outgoing chief of staff presents his successor with a single, sealed envelope. It contains no state secrets, no nuclear codes, no military strategies. It contains a ghost story. It is the unofficial, highly classified briefing on the man in the Waldorf Astoria. It is the story of America's most dangerous private citizen, General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. From 1951 until his death in 1964, every president of the United States, from Harry Truman to Lyndon B. Johnson, lived in the shadow of this one man. The public saw a living legend fading into graceful obscurity, a lion in winter residing in a palatial suite, penning his memoirs and occasionally emerging to deliver a speech filled with thunderous, old-fashioned patriotism. This image was a carefully maintained fiction, a piece of political theater designed to soothe the nerves of a nation, and, more importantly, to keep the lion from roaring. The truth was that Douglas MacArthur in retirement was infinitely more dangerous than he had ever been in command. His silence was not a sign of defeat. It was a strategic position. The fear was palpable in the Oval Office. It was a low-grade, constant hum of anxiety that shaped policy and haunted late-night conversations. Why would these powerful men, commanders-in-chief of the most formidable nation on earth, fear a single, retired general? It was not his lingering popularity with the public. It was not his political influence. It was the simple, terrifying fact that he knew. He was a walking, talking archive of the one secret that underpinned their entire world order, the existence of Chimera. Every president who inherited the White House inherited the terrible knowledge age of MacArthur's Oval Office confrontation with Truman. They knew he was not mad. They knew his warnings were real, and they knew he held the proof. Dwight D. Eisenhower, MacArthur's former aide-de-camp, understood the threat better than anyone. Ike was a master of the hidden hand, a president who operated through covert channels and subtle influence. He knew that the world was not as it seemed. Having commanded the Allied forces in Europe, he had seen the strange underbelly of the war, the inexplicable financial flows, the political decisions that defied military logic, all of which hinted at a deeper game. His relationship with his old boss was a tightrope walk of forced smiles and carefully worded letters. He feared MacArthur not as a political rival, but as a prophet who might, on any given day, decide the world was ready for the apocalypse of truth. Every major decision of the Eisenhower presidency, from the U-2 crisis to the covert operations in Iran and Guatemala, was haunted by a single, unspoken question. What will the old man in the Waldorf think? What does he know that we don't? Then came John F. Kennedy, the young Prince of Camelot, a man who believed he could remake the world. He was not beholden to the old guard. According to a source deep within the intelligence community at the time, a man who has never before spoken on the record, Kennedy did the unthinkable. In the first year of his presidency, he requested a secret off-the-books meeting with MacArthur, not at the White House, but at the Carlisle Hotel in New York, a neutral ground. Kennedy, it is said, wanted to know the truth about the deep state he felt was constantly undermining his authority. He wanted to know what Eisenhower had been so afraid of. The meeting, according to this source, lasted for 3 hours. MacArthur, now old and frail, but with an intellect as sharp as glacial ice, saw in the young president a potential heir to his secret war. He did not show Kennedy the star charts or speak of the Luzon Object. He gave him a piece of the truth, a more terrestrial and digestible version. He told him about Project Chimera, framing it as a rogue cabal, a secret government that had burrowed its way into the heart of the CIA, the FBI, and Wall Street finance. He warned Kennedy that these people would stop at nothing to protect their power. It was this meeting, the source insists, that directly led to Kennedy's famous vow to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. It was also the meeting that signed his death warrant. He had been warned by the ghost, and in acting on that warning, he made himself a target for the machine. MacArthur knew his own mortality was the final, critical variable in this long war. He could not allow the truth to die with him. Sometime in the late 1950s, he executed his last and most brilliant strategic maneuver. He assembled the ultimate weapon, a comprehensive dossier containing the complete, unvarnished history of his secret war. It held the story of the Luzon Object, detailed transcripts of its revelations, the true purpose of the island-hopping campaign, the secret purges in Japan, the real targets of his proposed atomic strikes in Manchuria, and most damningly, a list of names. It contained the names of every key Chimera operative in the United States and Europe that he had been able to identify. He did not place this doomsday book in a bank vault. He divided it into 7 parts, each one meaningless without the others. He sealed them in plain, unmarked envelopes. Then, he summoned the last surviving members of his most loyal inner circle, the men who had stood with him in the Luzon cave and fought his secret battles across the Pacific. These men, now gray-haired and invisible to history, were each given one envelope. They were given a simple, solemn instruction: live quiet lives. Do not contact one another. But upon the public confirmation of his death, they were to travel to a predetermined location, combine the contents of their envelopes, and release the complete dossier to every major news organization on the planet. This was the president's curse. It was a dead man's switch of unimaginable consequence. It transformed MacArthur from a simple threat into an existential paradox for the powers that be. While he lived, the secret was safe. His death, however, would trigger its release. The man they had silenced now had to be protected at all costs. The ghost in their machine was also the linchpin holding their world together. They needed to know where he was, who he spoke to, what he thought, but they could not touch him. His continued peaceful existence was the only thing standing between their shadow government and the blinding light of total exposure. The old soldier was not fading away. He was waiting, a sentinel guarding a bomb, knowing that the final battle would be fought not by him, but by his ghost. The 5th of April, 1964. On this day, in the Walter Reed Army Medical Center, the heart of the old soldier finally stopped beating. Douglas MacArthur was dead. For the nation, it was a moment of profound and somber reflection, the final closing of a heroic chapter in the American story. Flags were lowered to half-mast, eulogies were prepared, and a grateful country made ready to lay one of its most towering figures to rest. But in the hushed, soundproofed chambers of power, there was no grief. There was only a cold, electric wave of pure, undiluted panic. The ghost in the machine was gone. The linchpin had been pulled. The president's curse, the dead man's switch that had kept the shadow government in a state of suspended terror for 13 years, was now active. The countdown had begun. Lyndon B. Johnson, a man who understood power in its most visceral, primal form, knew what this meant. The ghost story he had been told upon taking office was now a clear and present danger. Somewhere out there, in the sprawling, anonymous landscape of America, were 7 old men, 7 phantoms from a forgotten war, who were now duty-bound to set the world on fire. The order went out from the Oval Office, an order that was never written down, that was spoken in a single, hushed conversation to J. Edgar Hoover. The order was simple: find them, find the letters, at any cost. What followed was the most extensive and most secret manhunt in American history, an operation so deeply buried it has no name, no file number, no official existence. The full, terrifying power of the FBI's COINTELPRO division, which had been ruthlessly effective at dismantling political movements, was now turned inward, hunting for the ghosts of its own nation's military. But this was not like hunting communists or civil rights leaders. The targets were not activists. They were masters of the fade. MacArthur had trained them well. They were men who knew how to live off the grid before the grid even had a name. They were experts in counter-surveillance, men who could sense a tail from a mile away, men who had spent their lives looking over their shoulders. For months, a shadow war raged across America, completely invisible to the public. FBI agents pored over old military records, conducted thousands of routine interviews with veterans of the Pacific Theater, and placed wiretaps on anyone who had ever had more than a passing acquaintance with the general. They were searching for a needle in a continent-sized haystack, chasing the faint, 70-year-old scent of a handful of men who had taken an oath in a cave in the Philippines. But they found nothing, not a single letter, not a single one of the 7 keepers. It was as if the men had simply dissolved into thin air, leaving behind no trace, no trail, no echo. Did Chimera's assassins, working through Hoover's network, find them one by one, silencing them before they could fulfill their final duty? Or were they simply too good, fading so completely into the American landscape that even the most powerful surveillance state in history could not detect them? The official story, whispered only in the deepest circles of the intelligence community, is that the letters were a bluff, a final, brilliant psychological operation by a master of the art. A ghost story the old general invented to keep his enemies at bay in his final years. But what if they weren't a bluff? What if the men, true to their last order, simply passed the legacy on? And so we are left looking back at the man himself, and the legacy he left behind is shattered into 1,000 irreconcilable pieces. The world remembers Douglas MacArthur as a brilliant but flawed giant, a man of immense ego and theatrical flair, the last of the great American proconsuls. They see the controversial figure who clashed with his president, a warrior from a bygone era who could not adapt to the new, gray world of limited warfare. This is the safe, comfortable portrait that hangs in the gallery of official history. But in the light of the hidden truth, a different portrait emerges. We see a man who was not a warmonger, but the lone sentinel on a wall that no one else could see. We see a man whose arrogance was the terrible certainty of a prophet who had seen the true face of the enemy. His obsession with the Pacific was not about personal glory. It was a desperate crusade to cleanse a theater of war that was infected with something far worse than any human empire. His forbidden proposal to use nuclear weapons was not the act of a madman. It was the last, desperate attempt of a surgeon to excise a planetary cancer, no matter how terrible the cost. He was a man who sacrificed his reputation, his command, and his place in history to keep a secret he knew the world was not ready to hear. He accepted the role of the disgraced villain to protect a population that could not possibly comprehend the nature of the beast that hunted them in their sleep. And so the questions remain, hanging in the air like radioactive dust, refusing to settle. What truly happened to the 7 letters? Are they still out there, locked away in a dusty attic, a forgotten safe deposit box, a family heirloom whose true significance has been lost to time, waiting for a new hand to uncover them? Do the descendants of the keepers still guard a secret they no longer understand? What became of the Luzon Object itself, the starstone left dormant and buried deep within the tunnel network of Corregidor? Is it still silent, its alien intelligence dreaming in the dark? Or is it waiting for a new signal, a new voice to awaken it and reveal the next chapter of its terrible history? And the final, most chilling question of all, the one that loops back to the beginning, to that frantic scrawl in a president's memo. What was the signal that Truman so desperately feared MacArthur would send? Was it a call to arms for a hidden human resistance? Or was it something else entirely? Was it a distress call, a beacon aimed at the alien star system on those ancient maps? A final desperate plea for help from the beings who had left their terrible stone on our world in the first place? Have all the secrets been revealed? Or is the truth still out there, hidden in plain sight, in archives still marked top secret, in the actions of world leaders that seem to defy logic, in the conflicts that erupt without reason? What will happen when the world finally learns the whole truth? What do you think? Was MacArthur a madman, or was he the only sane man in a world run by shadows? Write your theories in the comments below. What other historical mysteries are hiding a deeper, more sinister truth? Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Help us keep searching, because the greatest secrets in history are still waiting to be uncovered.